Good afternoon, comrades. Hope you've enjoyed the day so far. I thought I'd try and speak a little bit about class and then sort of go into the ideas of the party and organization. And I think much effort in recent decades has been expounded on trying to change our understanding of class, to try and move away from the sort of Marxist idea of the division, the central division in society around class, to turn class into a sort of sociological category, which is, sort of your exact income bracket or the level of education you have, or, some sort of cultural identity based on the sort of accent you have or what type of coffee you drink. But as Marx and Engels explained in the Communist Manifesto, societies have long been divided into classes of the oppressed and the oppressors, that the progression of history has been defined by the struggle between them, which has altered and developed the mode of production which governs the way a society is organized. And what they say is that the onset of capitalism has simplified these classes. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into the two great classes directly facing each other, the bourgeoisie as the capitalist class and the proletariat as the working class. Now, when they wrote this, when the Communist Manifesto was published, this was 1848. And since then, there has been a constant attempt by ruling classes to obfuscate this reality of class. And even, I think, particularly in recent decades, in the sort of neoliberal period, there's been, some elements of the left that have tried to claim that, because of deindustrialization, because of the rise of precarity, and so on, that class in the sort of Marxist conception of it is no longer relevant, or at least not as significant as it was. But I think in actuality, Marx and Engels' words are truer today than they were when they wrote it. In 2014, for the first time in history, the majority of the world population belonged to a wage-earning, non-agricultural workforce. Of this, industrial workers were up 50% between 1999 and 2013, making up a third of that workforce. And as of 2018, 55% of the world population live in urban areas. And I think it's not even just showing that this is still the case, but that these trends are continuing. And even, I think, in the West and in advanced sort of capitalist countries, manufacturing still plays a significant part of the economy, particularly in the United States and in Germany. But even where it has declined, particularly in places like Britain, much of what is now considered the service sector actually is sort of made up of logistics, of transport, of marketing, etc., which is still essentially part of that sort of production line of commodities that sort of creates that division in society. In a way, the sort of assembly line of the factories in heavy industry have turned into a global assembly line, of which workers in Britain are very much a part of. And we've also seen the sort of proletarianization, as called, of professions like teachers and lecturers and doctors, as well as the obvious and massive concentration of wealth in a smaller and smaller section of the capitalist class. By simplifying the class structure of society into a minority of exploiters and a vast majority of the exploited, and that the only way to maintain this society, the only way that the existence of the capitalist class can continue is dependent on the exploitation of the working class. This means, as Marx and Engels say, capitalism creates its own gravediggers. That for the first time in history, the proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority. And therefore, the working class is the only class that both has the interest in overthrowing capitalism and has the capability of doing so. So I think the question then arises, if that is true, if that is the case, then why hasn't it happened yet? And I think the simple answer to this, or one of anyway, is because the ruling class, as well as owning the physical means of production, own the mental means of production. That, as Marx says, the ruling ideas in society are those of the ruling class. It is, as I said at the start, this sort of constant attempt to obfuscate what class is and how society is run. Is the fact that the capitalist class own and run the education system, the press, that inbuilt into capitalism is competition, which divides workers, and there are new ways constantly being developed by the ruling class to divide us ever more, whether it's through racism, through sexism, through homophobia, and all other ways. And that is why we have this situation where, year on year in the National Attitude Survey, around 60% of the British population self-identify as working class. They have some idea that they belong to the working class. We have, in the last 3 years, seen that a majority of the population are opposed to the genocide in Gaza, are opposed to supporting Israel as our government is doing. We see time and time again that when posed with the question, should government money be spent on welfare or warfare, people prefer welfare. They prefer the idea of renationalizing our public services and so on. But at the same time, in recent years, we've seen a growing proportion of the population to now a majority who oppose immigration, who think that accepting refugees into this country might be a bad idea, who are often pulled into ideas of sort of national interest, especially when it comes to in opposition to other countries. We saw, for example, the levels of support there was for the Queen and the huge numbers of people who queued for days to see her dead body and so on. And I'm sure everyone here will also, through conversations with people, often hear the grievances people have with their bosses, with their work conditions, with their struggle with the cost of living crisis, but come to the conclusion that this is just the way it is. There's nothing that can be done about it. And so the working class can only take up its world historic task of overthrowing capitalism when it becomes conscious of itself as a class. As Trotsky, one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution in 1917, said, the proletariat, or the working class, assumes an independent role only at the moment when, from a social class in itself, it becomes a political class for itself. And as Marx says, because of this necessary antagonism generated by capitalism, workers begin to form trade unions to fight back over working conditions, over wages, and so on. But he goes on to say that the real fruit of the battle lies not in the immediate result of those struggles, but in the ever-expounding union of workers, that every class struggle is a political struggle, and that the consequence of working class people organizing together is that they develop an organization such as a political party. And in the history of the sort of working class movement over the last 150 years, there are two sort of particular forms of party that have emerged. And the first is the Reformist Party, whose purpose is essentially to try and win working class representation in Parliament, in the state. They never break with capitalism, but believe in a gradual transition by winning enough influence and enough seats in Parliament. But because, as we have said, there is this unevenness in the class consciousness in society, there is these contradictory ideas that are held, and because a Reformist Party's primary strategy is to try and win the most seats and so on, it necessarily means that they resort to lowest common denominator politics. And you see, for example, Andy Burnham, who's just become the Prime Minister, last week was celebrating passing Shabana Mahmood's really horrific, draconian anti-immigration laws. We've seen numerous examples across the European continent, even where there have been sort of radical left parties emerge in response to neoliberalism, that they often capitulate to those very ideas, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on warfare. And even at the best of times, even under the Labour Party, under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, or the Greens under Polanski and so on, there are all of these issues sometimes which, we're told now is not the time to discuss these things. Let's win the election first, then think about it. For the moment, we'll carry on supporting NATO or whatever it is. And it means that they hold back the most advanced class consciousness of the workers at the level of the least advanced class consciousness. It means that these parties substitute themselves for the class, substitute themselves for the class, and necessarily means that in their view, a workers' consciousness exists only insofar as the party does. It does not exist outside of the party, and every form of class struggle is subordinated to the advancement of the party. The Revolutionary Party, on the other hand, is a collection of the most advanced section of the class, whose purpose is to raise the consciousness and pull forward the rest of the class. It is the sort of necessary medium to overcome the contradiction of, on the one hand, the need for the emancipation of the working class to be conquered by the class itself, and on the other hand, the unevenness in consciousness that exists within it. And I think the best description of this is when Trotsky said that without the guiding organization, the energy of the masses would dissipate like steam not enclosed in a piston box. But nevertheless, what moves things is not the piston or the box, it's the steam. And it was the experience of the Russian Revolution in 1917 that showed most clearly the need for such an organization, and the need for such an organization ahead of a revolutionary situation. As Lenin repeatedly pointed out, the working class learns and becomes conscious through struggle. And the more the acute the crisis is, and revolutionary situation is the most acute of crises, it develops in those moments in leaps and bounds. But yet, it remains uneven. There will be sections of the class that are ahead of other sections of the class. And also, no matter how quickly the sort of political conclusions are drawn from the situation, they don't necessarily translate into organizational conclusions, into the immediate concrete tasks that need to be taken. And just as an example, I was involved in the Black Lives Matter movement that erupted here the first time round in 2016. And there was a huge swell of demonstrations, as well as the second time in 2020. And in both cases, there were huge swells of demonstrations on the streets, which were in the first instance in solidarity with what had happened in the United States with George Floyd, but which quickly, in and of themselves, from the people on the streets, began to relate to the issues of racism and racial discrimination as a systemic issue here in Britain. But it was a movement which had no revolutionary party leading it. It had not come out of a struggle in that way. And it meant that very quickly, the discussions in the movement about how to take that forward went to, we need to support Boris Johnson because we think he's actually being genuine. We shouldn't be antagonistic to the police. Or in 2020, what eventually killed off the movement entirely, a demonstration was called off at the last minute because a small group of fascists threatened to counter-mobilize, which led to complete disarray in the movement and its failure. And similarly, I remember, when the Grenfell tragedy happened, in the immediate aftermath of that disaster, there was a huge groundswell of anger and opposition. There was a huge connection automatically in people's minds that this was the direct result of political negligence. It was the direct result of austerity of a government that does not care about working class people, about black and brown people. In fact, 2 days after the fire, the local residents, as well as the wider community, stormed a local council meeting. They broke into the council meeting to shout at the councillors who were responsible. But again, with the absence of any sort of revolutionary party, with the absence of any sort of political leadership, that completely went away. The sort of local leadership decided we will wait for public inquiry. We will hold silent vigils, which, powerful as they are, have meant that 9 years later nothing has happened. That moment of anger, that moment of action that was there, was squandered. And so what Marx argues is that revolutionaries are not separate from the class. They are the most advanced and resolute section of the class, which pushes forward all others, but with the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march. That the party is, in Trotsky's word, the memory of the working class. It is armed with the theory that is formed out of an accumulation of the history of class struggle and its distillation so that it can concretely analyze the situation at present and derive from it the correct strategy and tactics that are needed at any given moment. And necessarily, this means, as George Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist, said, that the party, the Revolutionary Party, must be a step ahead of the struggling masses, but only one step ahead, so that it always remains the leader of the struggle. But as well as this, I think because it remains that the working class has to emancipate itself, and that this is a necessary part of being able to overcome capitalism, because as Marx says, it's not only the only way to dislodge the bourgeoisie, but is the only way that the class itself can remove the muck of ages, all the sort of contradictory ideas that have been thrown out at it over time, in order that it can found society anew. So because of that, the party cannot substitute itself for the class. And this was, particularly some of the fears of Marxists like Rosa Luxemburg and even Leon Trotsky before the Russian Revolution, when there were, a lot of debates going on about the kind of organization that revolutionaries need. And they were also afraid that there would be an inherent conservatism in revolutionary parties, because to carry on a revolutionary party in a non-revolutionary situation, necessarily there has to be a routine that is developed, and that at times when the crisis becomes acute, when the masses are developing rapidly and marching ahead, the party can end up lagging behind. And additionally, Lukács also says that theoretical clarity, agitation and propaganda by a conscious revolutionary group is not enough. And I say this as sort of three forms of criticism of the idea of a revolutionary party. But in response to that, Lenin, not directly responding to those things, but in general, responding to that, Lenin said that to be a party of the masses, not only in name, the party must throw itself into the struggles of the class, and it must get ever wider layers of the masses involved in the party, steadily elevate them from political indifference to protest, from that to socialist ideas, from that to supporting the movement, and from that to organized membership of the party. And I think this is a mistake that some of the sort of small revolutionary sects, which people in this room might be familiar with, make. Small groups of revolutionaries who predominantly focus on abstract propaganda and who find ways of separating themselves from the rest of the left, never mind the rest of the class, and to not work with them. And just as an example, it was mentioned earlier about your party. Back in November, when we were part of making a last-ditch attempt to save the party before it imploded, as it currently is doing, there was a moment at the founding conference when the party was about to expel revolutionary socialists from the organization. And for a very brief period, Carrie Murphy and those around her managed to do what capitalists haven't managed to do in 200 years, which is to unite the revolutionary left in a single cause. And there was a meeting that was organized in Liverpool to discuss how we can do this, and it had all the various groups of the radical left in it. And for my sins, I think it was punishment because I put a picture in the wrong place in the paper or something, I had to go along to this meeting and speak at it. And we had like some speeches, the discussion started, and within 5 minutes of discussion, it had been mentioned which parties don't have the right analysis on Ireland, which parties don't have the right analysis on Cuba, which parties have some misgivings about Corbyn or Sultana or neither or both. And the meeting just descended into chaos with people shouting at each other about the things that each other were wrong about. And I think that gives you an idea of how these political sects organize and why they are not the revolutionary party as is being described by the Marxist thinkers that I've talked about. I think instead what we do, and in order to sort of guard from some of those dangers of conservatism and substitution and so on, we must have a view of constantly learning from the working class. The sort of model developed in the run-up to the Russian Revolution by the Bolsheviks, by Lenin, in this regard, was that of democratic centralism, that the party must have maximum democracy. It must have the opportunity for all members of the party, all that sort of range of that of class consciousness, of the advanced class consciousness that is part of the party, to accumulate within the party and be able to share its experiences, especially in times of changing situations when things can change, so that the party is able to figure out what bits to generalize and so on. But at the same time, to be a centralized party so that it can overcome that unevenness in consciousness, that it can overcome the sort of sectionalism that can come sometimes in people's experiences, and that it can organize with unity in action. And we must seek to lead the working class in their struggles. And this is something that at present, I don't think any party on the left, any revolutionary party, can claim to do by themselves. And the tactic developed in response to this by the Third International following the Russian Revolution, and then elaborated by Trotsky in the fight against fascism in the 30s, is that of the United Front. That revolutionary parties should work with the reformist parties that still hold influence over working class people in order to organize mass struggles where they do agree on things, and not for a moment to dilute its own politics in the process, but in actually showing in practice the superiority of revolutionary politics and strategy. And this is the model that has been used to organize the Palestine movement and the anti-war movement in this country, which has mobilized millions of people on the streets. But it's a process that's constantly had to be led by revolutionaries. There's been revolutionaries who've constructed the United Front that have had to fight for unity at every step. They've constantly had to reconstruct and re-argue those things within the movement to provide leadership at critical moments, like on the 14th of October in 2023, a week after the genocide, when as yet at the moment there was wall-to-wall coverage in solidarity with Israel, and there were questions within the movement: is this the right time to actually have a demonstration? Should we wait for things to calm down? And it was revolutionaries that said, no, now is exactly the time that we have the movement. And I don't think the movement would have developed in the way that it did had we not, or on the 11th of November when Suella Braverman wanted to ban our demonstration, or for that matter more recently in pioneering the way for organizing the International Conference Against War, which I think was a massive breakthrough for the anti-war movement, not just here, but across the continent, and as well as in the sort of struggle to rebuild political trade unionism and so on. And I think in these situations, we should expect that in the absence of revolutionary organization, people will get outraged, people will develop a level of consciousness, people will get out on the streets, they will organize in their trade unions, and so on. But without leadership and direction, without that accumulation of history that's come before, it will mean relearning the lessons and the mistakes of the past. It will mean, it wouldn't necessarily mean that these movements are sustained or become vehicles for raising class consciousness. So our job, to sort of conclude, as Lukács says, is to unite with the spontaneous discoveries of the masses with the totality of revolutionary struggle, and to bring them to consciousness. And that is what we in Counterfire are trying to do. We don't claim to be the one true vanguard party in the reincarnation of Lenin, but it's the type of revolutionary organization that we are trying to build. And hopefully I've shown that that is necessary. Thanks.